My son leaned across the dinner table, looked me straight in the face, and spat on me. Not in a fit of rage, not when it was just the two of us, but in the middle of dinner, in front of his wife, his children, and guests who had been laughing and chatting. The room went dead silent for exactly 1 second. Then someone laughed. "You're old, Dad," he said. "Old, slow, and useless." I stayed seated. I didn't stand up. I didn't strike back. I didn't say a word. But the moment the spit touched my skin, I understood one thing very clearly. Tonight, I didn't lose my dignity. I had just reclaimed the power I had given away my entire life. And they had no idea. They were sitting on the very foundation I was about to quietly pull away. If you're still here, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Every comment helps this story reach more hearts. And if it moved you, give it a like so others can find it too. That dinner on paper was a very American family gathering. Sunday, 6 p.m. A long oak dining table set in the center of the room, a cream-colored tablecloth, warm yellow light from the ceiling fixture I had installed myself more than 20 years earlier. The smell of grilled meat mixed with mashed potatoes, melting butter, and a hint of red wine in the air. If someone had walked into that house without knowing anything, they would have thought this was a successful, peaceful family. My son, Evan, sat at the head of the table, shoulders straight, shirt neatly pressed. My daughter-in-law, Rachel, sat beside him, dress perfectly adjusted, her smile always just right. Not too warm, not cold either. The kind of smile people use when they want to hide judgment behind their eyes. My 2 grandchildren sat nearby, legs swinging under the table, forks tapping lightly against their plates while the adults talked. Rachel's parents were there too, along with one of Evan's friends and his partner, people I wasn't close to, but had seen a few times at past gatherings. I sat at the end of the table. No one assigned me that seat. No one told me to sit there. I chose it myself. Maybe because I had grown used to staying on the edge in my own home. Or maybe because I had learned not to take up space, anyone's space, even when it had once been mine. From the moment I stepped into the dining room, I felt that something was off. Not a direct hit to the face, but small, scattered details, just enough to make you feel like you didn't belong where you were standing. Rachel looked at me as I pulled out my chair. Not a curious look, not a greeting, but a quick, cold glance, as if I were an old piece of furniture placed incorrectly in a well-designed living room. She said nothing, just pressed her lips together, then leaned toward her mother and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I clearly saw the way her eyes flicked back toward me again, paired with a very slight smile. Not meant for the person in front of her, but for the feeling of standing above someone else. Evan was different. He didn't look at me right away. He was busy talking about work, about a new project, about numbers that even I could tell were big. He spoke quickly, confidently, laughing loudly at times, sipping his wine. Every time he mentioned his success, he unconsciously leaned back in his chair, like a landowner surveying his territory. I listened. I always listened. I had been used to that for a very long time. At first, everything stayed within limits I could still talk myself into accepting. A joke about age. A half-serious comment about the old jacket I was wearing. Evan looked at me, smirked. "Dad, don't you think that jacket is kind of outdated?" People laughed. Polite laughter. The kind people use when they don't want things to feel tense. I smiled lightly. I was used to that kind of joke. I told myself, he's just joking. He's my son. Rachel followed up, her voice softer but sharper. "I mean, maybe you should buy something newer. We do have guests over more often now." There was nothing rude in her words, but they pierced straight through me like a needle. Our house. The way she said it made one thing very clear. In that sentence, I was not included in our. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't explain that I had worn that jacket for 15 years, since the days I worked construction, since the days I used my savings to pay the down payment on that very house. I said nothing. I just kept eating. I had believed that if I stayed silent long enough, if I didn't react, things would eventually stop. I had believed that for years. But silence, it turns out, doesn't make people stop. It only lets them go further. One of Evan's friends, I don't remember his name, looked at me and said, half joking, "Walter still looks pretty healthy, but maybe you should rest more. Eating so slowly at your age isn't great, you know." More laughter, more exchanged looks. Evan didn't stop it. He laughed with them. A short, tight laugh, full of agreement. I lowered my gaze to the plate in front of me. The potatoes were cold. The meat had stopped steaming. My hand trembled slightly as I held my fork, but I tried not to let it show. I thought of evenings years ago when Evan was little, when I sat at this very table, cutting his meat into small pieces, reminding him to eat slowly, asking how school had been. I remembered the way he used to look up at me, eyes bright, voice proud when he said, "Dad." Now, at this same table, in the same room, I had become excess. Evan set his wine glass down and leaned toward me. His voice dropped, no longer joking. "You know, Dad," he said, "you sit there like you still matter." No one laughed. No one spoke. The room went quiet. I looked up at him. For the first time that night, I met my son's eyes. "But the truth is," he continued, "things are different now. You don't contribute anything anymore. I don't owe you anything." I hadn't even opened my mouth yet. I hadn't even taken a breath. Evan leaned farther across the table. The distance between us was less than an arm's length. Then he spat. The sensation wasn't what I had imagined. It wasn't hot or cold, just wet. Heavy. A small drop slid down my cheek and stopped at my collar. I heard Rachel inhale sharply. Not in horror, but as if she had just witnessed something interesting. Then someone laughed, a quick, awkward laugh, but enough to break the moment. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't shout. I reached for my napkin and slowly wiped my face. I did it carefully, as if afraid of spilling something else. When I looked up, Evan was still staring at me. There was no regret in his eyes, only contempt, and a hint of challenge as if he were waiting to see what I would do. I didn't give him the reaction he wanted. I placed the napkin on the table, gently, straight. I stood up. The chair scraped softly against the floor, but in that silent room it sounded louder than any scream. No one stopped me. No one called my name. I turned my back on the table, on the room, on my son. As I walked out of the dining room, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Tonight was not the end. This was the night I stopped being a father who endured, and the night I began to become a man with a plan. I stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind me. The laughter from the dining room still echoed faintly, like it was coming from another house. I stood there for a few seconds, one hand resting on the cold countertop, breathing slowly. Not to calm myself, but to let the memories flood in, the way they always waited behind my silence. I had lived long enough to understand that some moments in the present are just doors opening into the past. And that night when I turned away from the dinner table, my past, mine and my son's, came into focus more clearly than ever. Evan wasn't born this way. The day he was born, the small suburban hospital still used old fluorescent lights, casting a pale blue glow. I remember the sharp smell of disinfectant, the rubber scent of the doctor's gloves, and my wife Lena's hand gripping mine so tightly, her nails dug into my skin. When Evan cried for the first time, I cried with him. Me, a tall man with broad shoulders, used to hauling steel, crying like a child. In that moment, I believed I could do anything to protect that small life. Evan's early years passed in a tiny rental house with thin walls and creaky floors that groaned every time I came home after midnight. I worked construction during the day, warehouse night shifts on weekends. Some mornings I left before Evan woke up. Some nights I came home after he was already asleep. But every morning I left a small note on the kitchen table, just a few messy words. "Dad loves you." I don't know if Evan remembers, but I do. Then Lena died. The accident happened on a rainy afternoon. A truck lost control. A call from the hospital. A long, white hallway. I still remember the way the doctor looked at me, not with pity, but with the eyes of someone who had said those words too many times. I remember nodding, even though I didn't understand what they were saying. I remember stepping into the parking lot, standing in the rain, and realizing that from that moment on, I no longer had the right to fall apart. Evan was 6. I took him home after the funeral. He stood in the living room, looked around, and asked in a tiny voice, "Where did Mom go, Dad?" I knelt down and held him, smelling the baby soap in his hair. I lied. I said his mother had gone somewhere very far away. I said she was still watching over us. I didn't have the courage to tell the truth. And in that moment, I knew I would have to do everything twice, be both father and mother. The years that followed compressed my life into dense work schedules and ruthless frugality. I took every job I could, pouring concrete in winter, installing steel frames under scorching summer sun. My hands cracked. My knees ached whenever the weather changed. Once I slipped from a low scaffold and slammed my back into a steel rail. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the gray sky, wondering if I could get up. Then I thought of Evan getting out of school at 3 p.m., wondered who would pick him up if I didn't. I stood up. I always stood up. I learned to spend like a man in a trench, discount groceries, clearance clothes. I wore the same jacket for 10 years, replacing it only when the zipper finally broke. I often told Evan I wasn't hungry, that I'd eaten at work. In truth, many nights I drank only black coffee. But Evan always had a full lunchbox, shoes that fit, and new books every year. At night, even exhausted, I sat at the kitchen table checking his homework. Evan had a habit of reading his math problems out loud, looking up at me after each correct answer, waiting for my nod. Sometimes I fell asleep in the chair, my head resting on the table, but I still heard his voice, still nodded in my sleep. He once told his friends, "My dad is a hero." I never corrected him. I just smiled. As Evan grew older, I tried to teach him what I believed mattered. Respect others. Don't brag. Don't spend what you haven't earned. I taught him how to hold a hammer, how to change a tire, how to look people in the eye when he spoke. I believed that if I set the example long enough, he would understand. There were nights when Evan had a fever, and I sat by his bed, my hand on his forehead, counting his breaths. Mornings when I drove him to school in my old car with peeling paint and a radio that worked only sometimes. He told me about tests, teachers, the vague dreams of a child. I listened. I always listened. When Evan graduated high school, I sat in the auditorium wearing the only suit I owned, the collar slightly tight. When his name was called, I clapped until my palms turned red. I thought, I did it. I believed the hardest years were behind us. That was my first mistake. When Evan went to college, I kept supporting him as best I could. I never told him I had withdrawn from my retirement savings early to pay his first year's tuition. I never said I took extra weekend shifts to cover books. I thought it was a father's duty. I believed a father's love never needed acknowledgement. Once, Evan called me near midnight, panicked because his car had broken down on the highway. I drove almost an hour through the rain to reach him. By the time I arrived, I was soaked, hands shaking from the cold. Evan said only, "Good thing you came, Dad." Then he got in the car, pulled out his phone and called a friend. I told myself, he's tired. I always told myself that. When Evan graduated, got a job, then married, I thought things would balance out. I thought he had his own life now, his own responsibilities. I thought I could finally breathe a little slower, but I didn't realize that all those years I had been teaching Evan the wrong lesson. I had taught him that I would always be there, no matter what he did, no matter what he said, no matter how completely he forgot me. I believed that the more I gave, the more I would be valued. I believed a father's love was permanent, inexhaustible. I believed silent sacrifice would naturally be understood. But the truth is, when you give without boundaries, people don't learn gratitude. They only learn entitlement. That night, standing alone in the quiet kitchen, I looked down at my hands. Old scars crossed them. Thick, rough knuckles. Each mark was a year, a winter, an extra shift. I realized I had given Evan not only my youth, but my right to be respected. And that unconditional giving had planted the seed of the tragedy I had just witnessed in the other room. I didn't raise Evan to be cruel, but I did raise him to forget. As the laughter in the dining room faded, I straightened up. The memories closed like a book just finished. I knew with cold certainty that what happened that night was not the result of a single reckless moment. It was the outcome of an entire lifetime of carrying burdens and of confusing love with erasing myself. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer until those memories settled like dust after a strong wind. In the dining room, the sound of forks against plates grew sparse. The conversation drifted to other topics, as if my presence had never interrupted the meal. I didn't return to the table. I knew I wasn't ready, and perhaps I no longer had any obligation to be. The years of Evan's adulthood passed quickly. So quickly, I only noticed when I looked back. After graduation, he found steady work, decent pay, then met Rachel. Their wedding was simple but proper, held in a small suburban church. I sat in the front row, listening to Evan recite his vows, watching him stand tall, his voice steady. I thought, he's finally become a man. I didn't know that was only the beginning of another change, one I hadn't been clear-eyed enough to see. In the first months after the wedding, Evan still called me fairly often. Not every day, but enough for me to feel I still existed somewhere in his new life. He talked about their small rented apartment, his job, long-term plans. I listened, offered advice sparingly, always careful not to intrude. I wanted to respect his independence. Then Evan talked about buying a car. He needed something better for work, something that would project a professional image. I understood. The world had changed. I agreed to help without hesitation. I went with him to the dealership, sat on bright leather chairs, listened as the salesman explained interest rates and insurance packages. Evan looked at me, waiting. I signed as a co-signer, my familiar signature flowing easily, just as it had so many times before. When the car rolled off the lot, Evan smiled and patted my shoulder. "Thanks, Dad." Just 3 words, but at the time they felt like enough. Not long after came the house. Evan and Rachel wanted to buy instead of renting. "Something more stable," Rachel said. I went with them to see it. The house wasn't big, but it sat in a quiet neighborhood with a small front lawn and an old maple tree in the corner of the yard. I had stood under that tree, watching Evan and Rachel imagine their future. I saw myself from years ago standing there with Lena in front of our first home. That feeling softened me. I helped them pay the down payment. I co-signed the mortgage. I didn't tell them that the money was most of what I had saved after years of working. I just said, "I can help." Evan hugged me, quick, brief, almost automatic. Rachel smiled and said, "Thank you," but her eyes had already changed. Not gratitude, calculation. From that point on, everything changed very slowly. So slowly that if you weren't paying attention, you would think nothing was happening. Evan's calls became less frequent. No more casual check-ins. No more small talk. Every time the phone rang and Evan's name appeared, I already knew what the conversation would be about. The electric bill went up, car insurance, an unexpected repair. I listened. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. I transferred the money. I told myself, it's family. There were weeks when I didn't get a single call. Then, suddenly, Evan would call late one night. His voice rushed. "Dad, can you help me out a bit?" I didn't ask why. I only asked how much. After hanging up, I sat there watching the phone screen go dark. The room was silent. I wasn't sad. I was just empty. I started making excuses for him, the way I always had. I told myself Evan was busy, that married life came with pressure. I told myself young men today carry more weight. I remembered the days when I was tired too, when I stayed silent too, and I forgave him. I always forgave him, even when there was no apology. Rachel was different. She never called me, never texted. When we met, she was still polite, but her politeness was cold and sharp. Her words were always wrapped in a perfect shell, but inside was undisguised judgment. She talked about living expenses, about standards, about how everyone has to contribute. Every time she said those things, I felt less like Evan's father and more like a line item on their financial balance sheet. Shared dinners began to take on a different tone. They were no longer gatherings. They were appointments. One Sunday a month, usually after Evan texted ahead of time, "Are you free this week?" Not, "I miss you, Dad." Just, "Are you free?" I still went. I always arrived on time. I brought a cheap bottle of wine or a simple dessert. I didn't want to show up empty-handed, even though no one had ever asked. When I stepped into their house, Rachel was usually busy with something. Evan was on his phone. No one hurried to greet me. I sat down and waited for dinner to start, like a familiar guest who wasn't really necessary. At those meals, the conversation revolved around Evan's work, their plans, the next things they wanted to buy. I listened, like I always had. But now, no one asked what I thought. No one asked how I was doing. I existed like an extra chair at the table, nice to have, but not missed if it wasn't there. One time, I couldn't come because my back pain was unbearable. I texted ahead. Evan replied with just, "Okay." Nothing more. Not a single question. I lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, and for the first time, I felt a sadness I couldn't name. Not sadness from pain. Sadness from realizing my absence left no gap at all. I still chose silence. I was used to it. Silence made everything look calmer. Silence helped me believe I was still fulfilling my role as a father. I was afraid that if I spoke up, if I asked why, everything would break in ways I couldn't control. And I had spent my entire life keeping things from breaking. But deep down, I knew a shift had happened. The gratitude that once existed, awkward hugs, sincere "thanks, Dad," had slowly turned into something else. A sense that my help was expected, that I should be there, that I should give, without asking, without reminding. I hadn't noticed when the boundary disappeared. Maybe it was when I signed another document without reading it carefully. Maybe when I transferred money without explanation. Or maybe when I kept silent even as my chest started to feel heavy. In the kitchen, I washed my hands under cold water. The water ran over my fingers, over old scars. I looked at my reflection in the cabinet mirror and saw a man older than I had imagined. Tired eyes, but not completely defeated. I realized I had traveled a long road from being appreciated to being obligated, and I was the one who had paved that road for Evan. I had made everything too easy. I had believed love needed no conditions. I had been wrong. Laughter rose again from the dining room. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands. I took a deep breath. Not to return to the table, but to remember this feeling, the feeling of a man beginning to understand that his silence over all those years hadn't been noble. It had only delayed a tragedy waiting to surface. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on the towel hanging by the sink, and stood there a little longer. In the mirror, my face appeared blurred under the weak yellow light. Not because the mirror was dirty, but because my eyes had grown used to seeing everything through a thick layer of acceptance over many years. I turned away from the kitchen, not back to the table, but slowly down the hallway to the small room at the end. The room I had lived in since Evan and Rachel moved in temporarily. A temporary arrangement that stretched until it became permanent. Contempt didn't arrive all at once. It didn't crash down like a storm. It came little by little, quietly, patiently, the way time wears down stone. At first it was just comments that seemed harmless, wrapped in laughter and joking tones. "Dad, you're old. Let us handle this. It'll be faster." "Dad, you should rest. You can't keep up with technology anymore." Those remarks appeared more and more often. Not from strangers, from my own son, from the child who once held my hand crossing the street, who once trembled and called for me at night because he was afraid of the dark. Each time I smiled lightly and nodded, as if agreeing that I truly was outdated. I told myself it was just the younger generation's way of speaking, that Evan didn't mean anything by it, that he was just growing up in his own way. Rachel was more subtle. She rarely spoke directly. She used words that were soft, perfectly rounded, but that smoothness made it impossible to argue. She would stand in the middle of the living room, look around, and let out a very quiet sigh. "The house feels a bit dark, doesn't it? And these pieces look pretty old." I knew she was talking about the sofa set I had bought more than 20 years earlier. I had sat on it with Lena, drinking morning coffee, reading the paper, talking about small things in life. To Rachel, it was just outdated furniture. To me, it was memory. Once she said very calmly, "Old houses tend to have that smell. You know, that elderly smell." She didn't look at me when she said it, but I knew I was the only person in that house who fit that description. I stood there, my hand resting on the back of the chair, saying nothing. I thought about opening a window. I thought about how the smell of old wood, the smell of time, the smell of a life could be reduced to 2 simple words. Gradually, I realized no one asked for my opinion anymore. Not because I didn't have one, but because no one thought it was necessary to ask. They changed the color of the living room walls. I only found out when the contractors arrived. They replaced the lights, the curtains, rearranged the furniture. Every time I asked, Evan just said, "It's a small thing, Dad. We're doing it for convenience." Convenience for whom, I didn't know. I only knew that familiar corners disappeared, replaced by new things I had no say in. I lived in my own house like a long-term tenant, watching new owners renovate without any right to speak. Evan talked more and more about his success, projects, bonuses, big plans. He talked at dinner, his voice full of pride, his eyes lighting up whenever he mentioned numbers. I listened, as I always had, but something in the way he spoke had changed. He was no longer sharing. He was boasting. "We just closed a major deal. I think in a few years, I'll move up even higher." Each time I nodded and offered congratulations. I didn't mention the money I had transferred. I didn't mention my signature on documents without which those steps wouldn't have been possible. I stayed silent because I didn't want to become the father who kept score. I believed that silence was noble, but in their eyes, that silence meant something else. I began to see it in the looks they exchanged, in the way Evan lost patience when I spoke slowly, in the way Rachel sighed quietly whenever I asked her to repeat something, in how they continued talking when I had just opened my mouth as if my voice were nothing more than background noise. One evening, I sat in the armchair watching the local news. Evan and Rachel stood in the kitchen, talking about renovating it. I caught words like replace everything, modern style, get rid of the old stuff. Then Evan said, loud enough for me to hear, why keep these things? They're old. I wasn't sure if he was talking about the furniture or about me. Over time, my silence was no longer seen as patience. It was seen as agreement, that I had no opinion, that I had nothing left to contribute except not being a bother. There were moments when I sat in the living room with the television off, just looking around. Old photographs on the wall were taken down, replaced with abstract decor. The bookshelves I had built by hand were removed to keep things neat. I looked at that house and felt something strange. It was still my home, but it no longer belonged to me. That feeling didn't come all at once. It came step by step, day by day, until one day I realized I had learned to sit in one specific spot, not move too much, not touch anything, as if afraid of disturbing the new order. I had become part of the background, an old piece of furniture, present if needed, unnoticed if not. Yet even as that feeling rose, I kept telling myself one thing to stay upright. He's my son. I repeated it in my head every time I was ignored, every time I was talked over, every time I felt myself being pushed away from the center of my own life. He's my son. That sentence was both a reason and an excuse. I deceived myself into believing all families were like this, that parents eventually had to step back, that at a certain age you should know when to stay quiet so your children could be comfortable. I called it sacrifice. I called it love. But deep inside there was a small voice, very small, that I chose not to hear. That voice asked one simple question. If this is love, why do I feel so small? There were nights when I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to Evan and Rachel's footsteps in the hallway. They talked about weekend plans, friends, places they wanted to go. I wasn't part of those conversations. I wasn't angry. I was just absent. When contempt became a habit, I can't say. Maybe from the first time my opinion wasn't asked, or the first time I was reminded that I was old, or the moment I chose silence instead of speaking how I felt. I believed patience would be rewarded. I believed family bonds could endure anything. I believed that as long as I didn't make a fuss, everything would be fine. But the truth is, every time I deceived myself like that, I stepped back another inch. And when you step back far enough, others stop seeing you. They only see the empty space, and they get used to that space staying quiet. That night, sitting alone in the small room as the laughter outside rose and faded, I realized that contempt doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be repeated long enough, in the silence of the person enduring it. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time that night, listening as the house slowly fell quiet. When the laughter fully stopped, when Evan's door closed, when the hallway lights dimmed to their familiar low glow, I finally stood up. I walked slowly out of the room, down the hallway I had once laid, plank by plank, measuring each wall with an old wooden ruler. Beneath my feet, the floor creaked softly, like a familiar sigh. This house, in practice, had stopped being mine long ago, at least in the way people lived inside it. The day Evan and Rachel moved in, I had said something very simple. Stay here until you're settled. At the time, I thought of my own unstable years, of the feeling of never having solid ground. I believed that if I could give my son a foundation, he would stand more firmly than I ever had. I didn't say much. I just opened the door, moved my things aside, and gave them the larger room. That was how I gave away the use of the house. No complicated paperwork, no conditions, just the simple trust of a father. But there were things I didn't give away. Not because I was calculating, but because of the cautious habits of a man who had lived long enough to know that kindness does not replace clarity. Legal ownership of the house remained in my name. The original documents were stored in an old drawer in my study, a room few people ever entered. I had never thought of using them. To me, they were just formalities, a small detail not worth mentioning, until it became worth mentioning. Evan lived in this house like a conqueror. He hosted guests, threw parties, spoke about the house with pride. "My house," he said, guiding friends through the living room, pointing out new changes. People nodded, impressed. No one asked who I was. Once, a man shook my hand and asked, "Are you family?" I smiled and said I was the homeowner's father. He hesitated, then gave a polite laugh. I didn't blame him. I just remembered that feeling. The feeling of being pushed out of the center of the very place I had built. Gradually, I was no longer welcomed. Not with words, but with atmosphere. On evenings when I came home late, the front door was no longer left open. I had to unlock it myself, turn off the lights myself. On mornings when I woke early, the kitchen had been rearranged again. Everything was clean and orderly, but unfamiliar. The items I used were moved to the side as if to avoid interfering with the main routine. I began to feel like a long-term guest who had forgotten he was once the owner. Neighbors started whispering. I sensed it in their looks, in their half-veiled questions. "You still live there? Your son is really doing well. I heard he renovated the whole place." I nodded, smiled lightly, defended my son out of instinct. I said Evan was just building his own life. I said the younger generation needed space. I said everything was fine. I said it to them and to myself. I didn't realize that while I was protecting my son's image in public, I was eroding my own place inside that house. I didn't realize that by staying silent in the face of every encroachment, I was teaching Evan that boundaries could be erased without consequence. One afternoon, I stood in the living room watching Evan sign a stack of papers. He was on the phone, confident, mentioning the house address, speaking about property value as if it were a number attached to his name. I stood there, hearing every word, and for the first time, something heavy settled in my chest. Evan truly believed the house was his, not because he was deceitful, but because I had let him believe it. I had nurtured that belief with every concession, every step backward. I had let him think power came from taking space, not from respect. I hadn't seen that Evan's confidence wasn't built on independent strength, but on the foundation I had quietly propped up behind him. The first clue that something else existed appeared on a very ordinary morning. I opened the drawer in my study to retrieve some old documents. Light fell across yellowed folders. I flipped through page after page without a clear purpose, just an old habit, checking what I had stored away. My name was still there, clear, undimmed, unreplaced. In that moment, I didn't think of revenge. I thought of truth, a simple but heavy truth. Real power had never left my hands. It had just been lying still, waiting for me to notice. I closed the drawer gently, as if afraid of breaking something fragile. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't reveal it. But from that day on, whenever Evan spoke of the house with ownership in his voice, it no longer hurt. I simply saw clearly. Power doesn't lie in who speaks the loudest. It lies in the quiet lines on paper, in signatures placed in the right places. I used to think my voice was all I had. And when that voice was ignored, I thought I had lost everything. But it turned out I was looking in the wrong direction. I kept living the same way, still silent, still yielding. But that silence changed color. It was no longer submission, it became observation. Every change in the house, every boast, every time Evan called this house an achievement, I took note. Not out of resentment, but to understand the full picture. I hadn't realized I was raising someone ungrateful. Not because Evan was born that way, but because I had taught him that gratitude wasn't necessary. I had made receiving too easy, to the point where it lost all value in the eyes of the one receiving it. That night when I returned to my room, I sat down at the small table and placed my hand on the worn wooden surface. I didn't open any documents. I didn't write anything. I just sat there, feeling something very new forming inside me. Not anger, not pain, but clarity. For the first time in many years, I understood that my real power had never disappeared. It had only been hidden by my own blind trust. And when I stood up, turned off the light, and walked to the bed, I knew that once certain things are seen clearly, they can never return to the way they were before. That dinner party hadn't been planned far in advance. It came up as one of Rachel's spontaneous ideas, mentioned on a weekend afternoon in a gentle tone, as if it were just a casual family meal. But the moment I stepped into the living room that evening, I knew immediately that it wasn't a night meant for family. The lights were brighter than usual. Crystal glasses were neatly arranged on the table, reflecting a cold shine. The smell of perfume mixed with red wine, overpowering the familiar scent of the house. People I had never met stood talking near the fireplace. Others sat on the sofa where I used to read the newspaper every morning. Laughter scattered through the room, not loud but sharp, like small pieces of glass striking each other. Evan stood in the center of the room, holding a wine glass, laughing easily. He looked very different from the child who once stood behind me, shy around strangers. Now he was relaxed, confident, speaking like the true owner of the house. Rachel stood beside him, adjusting her dress, occasionally resting a hand on Evan's arm, her eyes scanning the room as if taking inventory of an accomplishment. I stood slightly off to the side near the door, unsure for a brief moment where I belonged. No one noticed me right away, and I realized that this kind of not noticing was very familiar, not because I was invisible, but because my presence was no longer considered necessary. When I moved closer to the dining table, a few people turned and nodded politely. Evan introduced me to a young couple in an even tone. "This is my father." Nothing more, no emphasis, no pride, just a secondary piece of information, like introducing an old item in the house out of courtesy. We sat down. I took my place at the end of the table, as usual. Plates were set down, the food steamed. People began talking, raising their glasses. The conversation revolved around work, real estate, upcoming vacations. I listened, nodded, smiled lightly when needed. I had been used to this role for a long time. The jokes started after the second glass of wine. A man sitting across from me glanced at my jacket and smirked. That jacket must be durable. Decades, and it still hasn't fallen apart. He said it like a joke, but his eyes weren't joking. Evan laughed along. My dad's very frugal. Still likes old things. Rachel added lightly, "If it still works, that's fine. But some things, keeping them just weighs the space down." I wasn't sure whether she was talking about the jacket or about me. People laughed. I laughed too, out of reflex. I told myself it was fine, just jokes, but they didn't stop. They kept coming, each one a little sharper, a little more direct. At this age, it's hard to keep up with new things. That's how old people are, used to it. Those comments weren't aimed directly at me, but no one else at the table fit them. I felt myself being stripped layer by layer, not with knives, but with laughter. Evan drank more wine. His voice grew louder. He talked about his success, about what he had achieved. He said, "I," again and again. "I did this. I decided that. I built this." Each time I felt a hollow open in my chest. Not jealousy, but the realization that, in my son's story of his own life, I had been erased from the picture. Then Evan turned toward me. His eyes carried a bit of alcohol, a bit of irritation, and a great deal of poorly concealed contempt. "You know, Dad," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, "sometimes I think you should just retire completely." The room slowed. I looked up at him. "Retire?" I asked calmly. Step away from this stuff, Evan continued. From family gatherings, from dinners like this. You just sit there not saying anything, and it makes people feel uncomfortable. A few people chuckled softly. Rachel placed her hand on her wine glass, said nothing, but the corner of her mouth lifted just slightly. You don't contribute anything anymore, Evan went on, this time without smiling. I appreciate what you did before, but now it's different. Now it's my turn to handle things. I looked at Evan. For the first time that evening, I truly looked at my son. I saw a man trying to prove something in front of others, and I, unfortunately, was the most convenient obstacle. I don't owe you anything, Evan said firmly. In that moment, every excuse I had ever made for him collapsed. I could no longer find a way to defend those words in my own mind. And then, before I could say anything, Evan leaned across the table. The act happened quickly, but it wasn't unconscious. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a loss of control. It was a choice. The spit hit my face, cool and heavy. A small drop slid down my cheek and stopped at my collar. The room froze. Then Rachel let out a soft laugh. Not loud, not noisy, just a light exhale, as if she had just witnessed something interesting, something she hadn't expected to happen so quickly. Someone else laughed too, awkwardly. Then the laughter spread, scattered but enough to shatter any chance of resistance. I stayed seated, not because I couldn't stand up, not because I was afraid, but because in that moment I realized that if I said anything, if I made any gesture at all, I would only continue the game they had set up for me. I reached for my napkin and wiped my face slowly. I didn't look at Evan. I didn't look at Rachel. I looked at the plate in front of me, where the food had long gone cold. My silence stretched on, longer than was comfortable, long enough for the laughter to die out, long enough for someone to clear their throat, for someone else to shift their chair. I placed the napkin down, neatly, carefully. I stood up. The chair made a very small sound, but in that silent room it rang like a warning. No one stopped me. No one apologized. No one said a word. I walked out of the dining room, leaving behind a kind of silence they had never known. It wasn't my familiar patience. It was withdrawal, severance, the end of a role I had carried for far too long. When I closed the door behind me, I knew the decision had been made. No need to say it, no need to swear anything. And in that terrifying silence, the only thing echoing in my mind was a cold, clear truth. Tonight wasn't just humiliation, it was the final drop. I stepped into the kitchen and closed the door behind me. The door shut very softly, almost without a sound, yet that moment created a clearer boundary than any words ever could. The sounds from the dining room, laughter, clinking glasses, chairs scraping, were cut off, reduced to a distant murmur, as if coming from another house, another life I no longer belonged to. In the kitchen, the fluorescent light shone down on the empty countertop. The smell of food still lingered, mixed with red wine and the heavy perfume Rachel liked to wear. I stood still for a few seconds, both hands resting on the edge of the sink, feeling the cold water run as I lightly turned the faucet. The clear stream flowed through my fingers, carrying a chill that sharpened my awareness more than any burst of anger could have. I looked out the small window above the sink. Outside lay the darkness of the backyard, where I had once planted a small apple tree for Evan. The tree had grown tall, its branches spreading wide, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd been out there. Just like many things in this house, they were still there, but they no longer belonged to me in the same way. The humiliation from minutes earlier didn't disappear immediately. It lingered, like a bruise slowly surfacing under the skin. But strangely, instead of spreading into sharp pain, it gradually transformed into something else. A cold clarity, frighteningly clear. I thought about Evan, about the look in his eyes when he said, "I no longer had value." about the way Rachel laughed softly, as if what had just happened was merely an interesting detail in her evening. If this had been a few years earlier, I might have asked myself where I went wrong, how I had raised my son to speak that way, what I had done to deserve being treated like that. But tonight, for the first time, I didn't ask those questions. I realized that for many years I had confused being ignored with losing power. I had believed that because my voice was no longer heard, I no longer mattered. But standing alone in this kitchen, I suddenly understood something very simple. My real power had never vanished. I had simply stopped using it. I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the towel hanging beside it. That familiar motion reminded me of countless times I had stood in this very kitchen after long workdays, washing my hands before sitting down to eat with my family. Back then, I didn't think about power or control. I thought about responsibility. But responsibility, when stretched too long without boundaries, turns into a burden others assume you will always carry. I pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table. In front of me was a bare wooden surface, marked only by faint scratches. Scratches I knew each one of. I placed both hands on the table, took a deep breath, and let my memory do what it did best: work quietly and precisely. Documents. I didn't need to open a drawer to know where they were. I had stored them there long ago in the wooden cabinet in my study, the room Evan rarely entered and Rachel had never shown any interest in. In my mind, I saw each folder clearly: the house deed, old contracts, savings books, bank accounts where my name still appeared, properly and legally. I remembered clearly the day I signed the papers to buy this house. Evan was still young then, running around the empty living room, laughing as his footsteps echoed off bare walls. Lena stood beside me, her hand resting on my arm, saying this would be the place where we would grow old. I don't remember the exact amount of money anymore. I remember the certainty I felt as I signed. The feeling that I was building something solid. That feeling had never left me. I had just forgotten it. I began recalling every account, every number, every financial decision I had made over the years. I remembered transferring money to Evan, co-signing loans, guaranteeing things without hesitation. I remembered clearly that in all of it, I had never fully surrendered final control. Not because I distrusted my son, but because I had grown used to always leaving myself an exit. Now that exit stood clearer than ever. The pain in my chest eased, replaced by a calm I hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of standing firmly on my own 2 feet, without needing anyone to support me, without needing anyone's approval. I realized I didn't need to go back into the dining room to say anything. I didn't need confrontation. I didn't need explanations. I didn't need to force Evan or Rachel to justify themselves. Words at this point were meaningless. They would only put them on guard, or worse, make them believe I was acting on emotion. But I wasn't acting on emotion. I needed strategy. Strategy isn't born from anger. It comes from clarity, from seeing the entire picture and accepting the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The truth was that Evan had grown used to treating my silence as a given. Rachel had grown used to seeing me as part of the background, nothing more. And that very familiarity would keep them from noticing what was coming. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I did nothing. I simply sat and thought, rearranging everything in my mind the way someone tidies a cluttered room. Each thought placed where it belonged. Each memory revisited with new eyes. Outside, the laughter softened. I heard chairs being moved, footsteps crossing the floor, Evan saying something I no longer paid attention to. Those sounds no longer touched me the way they once had. They passed through like rain on a roof, there, but not seeping in. I stood up, walked to the switch, and turned off most of the kitchen lights. I left just a small glow, enough to see my way. I didn't want the kitchen bright. I wanted it quiet, discreet, like what I was preparing to do. When I returned to my room, I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, listening to my own breathing, each breath steady, slow. I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't confused. There was only a cold certainty. I understood that from this moment on, I would no longer be the man who silently endured in his own house, but I also wouldn't become someone loud, demanding attention. I would do what I had done best my entire life, work in silence. This time, silence wasn't patience. It was a weapon, and I knew very well that when silence is used correctly, it can change everything, without a single threat ever being spoken. I waited until the house was completely still. No more laughter, no more footsteps in the hallway, no more clinking of dishes in the sink. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock, doing what it had done for decades, taking no sides, indifferent to what had just happened. I got up from the bed, pulled on my old sweater, and stepped into the hallway. The night light cast a pale yellow strip across the wooden floor. I moved very quietly, not because I was afraid of being heard, but out of the habit of someone who had lived his life trying not to disturb others. The study was at the end of the hall, its wooden door closed. This was the one room in the house Evan almost never entered, and Rachel had never once asked what was inside. I opened the door and turned on the light. The familiar smell of old paper, wood, and time immediately wrapped around me. On the desk was still the lamp I'd bought back when Evan was in elementary school. On the shelves were notebooks and folders, neatly arranged according to a habit I had kept my entire life. I pulled out the chair and sat down, unhurried. I no longer needed to rush. The bottom drawer of the wooden cabinet made a very soft sound as I pulled it open. It was heavy. Not because of the wood, but because of what lay inside. I took out a bundle of documents bound with a worn rubber band. The old band loosened as I removed it, making a faint sound that seemed louder than I expected in the quiet room. Paperwork. I placed the folder on the desk and opened it page by page. The paper had yellowed, but the text was still clear. My name was there, neat, familiar, Walter H. Coleman, not altered. Not crossed out, not replaced. Ownership of the house was still mine. I sat there looking at that line for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not because I was surprised, I had known this all along, but tonight it carried a different meaning. It was no longer a lifeless administrative detail. It was the truth, a truth Evan and Rachel had forgotten or had never truly understood. I flipped through the other documents, old loan agreements, supplemental addendums, bank accounts. Some of them were joint accounts, opened years ago when Evan had just started working and needed my name on them to get by. My name was still there. My authority was still intact. No one had ever asked me to remove it, and I had never done so myself. I remembered every time I signed my name. Once it was on a rainy afternoon. Evan sat across from me at the kitchen table, gripping a cup of cold coffee. He talked about work, about pressure, about needing temporary support. I listened, nodded, and signed. I didn't ask much. I didn't hesitate. Back then, my signature meant absolute trust. Another time was at the bank. A young employee explained the terms, while Evan looked at me with a mix of gratitude and expectation. I signed, believing I was doing the right thing. I signed, believing that fatherhood didn't need insurance. Tonight, looking back at those signatures, I didn't feel ashamed. I didn't feel regret either. I simply saw more clearly than ever that blind love can bring a man dangerously close to self-destruction. If I kept believing that giving was enough, if I kept closing my eyes as boundaries faded, I would lose not just my assets, but myself. But the law is different. The law isn't blinded by family ties. It doesn't care about emotions, spoken promises, or who speaks the loudest at a dinner party. It only cares about what is written, what is signed, what is carefully stored in folders like these. And in the world of the law, I was still standing. I stacked the papers neatly. My hands didn't shake. I didn't hesitate. The calm I felt wasn't something I forced. It came naturally, as if it had been there all along, waiting for me to allow myself to use it. Though I realized I didn't need to argue with Evan. I didn't need to demand an apology from Rachel. Those conversations, if they happened at all, would only make things louder and more complicated. I didn't need noise. I needed preparation. I took a thick envelope from the drawer and placed a few of the most important documents inside. Not many, just what was necessary. I didn't gather everything at once. I didn't want to leave traces. I only wanted to make sure that when the time came, I wouldn't have to scramble. I looked around the study one more time. On the wall still hung an old photo of Lena and me, taken in front of this house on the day we first moved in. I stood there for a long moment, not to reminisce, but to remind myself that this house had been built by two people who believed in decency, not greed or showmanship. I turned the photo face down, not because I wanted to forget, but because I needed to look ahead. In my mind, a thought slowly took shape, not as an impulse, but as a decision that had fully matured. I would leave. Not tonight. Not in a rush of emotion. But when everything was ready, when the numbers, the documents, and the legal path were firmly in my grasp, and I would do it without anyone knowing in advance. No warning, no tears, no drama. I had lived my whole life in silence. I understood its power. My departure, when it happened, wouldn't be like a door slammed shut. It would be like a foundation quietly removed, silent but irreversible. I turned off the light in the study and closed the door. The hallway was still quiet. I walked back to my room, the envelope tucked under my arm, light as air. When I placed it in a private drawer beside my bed, I didn't feel burdened. I felt light. I lay down, staring at the ceiling in the dark. The clock continued ticking. Somewhere else in the house, Evan and Rachel slept soundly, unaware that what they believed to be a given was about to disappear. I didn't feel satisfaction at that thought. I only felt necessity. Tonight, I didn't plan revenge. I did one thing I should have done long ago: protect myself. And in that silence, I understood that the strongest weapon they never expected wasn't my anger, nor my words. It was the quiet papers in a drawer and the patience of a man who had decided to leave without asking permission. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Not because I couldn't sleep, but because I no longer wanted to lie there. The house was still quiet, the false quiet of a place where everyone believed everything was still intact. I washed my face, got dressed, and chose the simplest outfit I owned. Not to hide anything, but because I no longer needed to perform any role. I left the house while Evan and Rachel were still asleep. I didn't leave a note. I didn't make unnecessary noise. I locked the door as I did every day, slipped the key into my coat pocket, and stepped down onto the porch. The morning air was cold, clean, and sharp. I took a deep breath, feeling my lungs open fully, as if they too had just been freed from something heavy that had clung for far too long. Leonard Brooks's office was on a quiet street, a few blocks from downtown. I had known him for many years, through small transactions, occasional consultations. Leonard wasn't a talkative lawyer. He was a few years older than me, his hair almost completely gray, his voice low and even, his eyes always calm. A man who understood that silence is sometimes the best tool for resolving anything. When I walked in, the secretary looked up, slightly surprised to see me without an appointment. But when I said Leonard's name, she nodded immediately, as if used to my unannounced appearances. I sat in the waiting chair, hands resting on my thighs, unhurried. I didn't need to rush. What I carried was already neatly placed in the envelope. Leonard invited me into his office after a few minutes. He looked at me, didn't bother with small talk, just gestured for me to sit. I placed the envelope on the desk and slid it toward him. "It's time," I said. Leonard didn't ask. "Time for what?" He opened the envelope and flipped through the papers, his eyes moving quickly but carefully. He knew me well enough to understand that if I was sitting there, every decision had already been weighed. I didn't explain at length. I didn't recount the dinner party. I didn't mention the spit, Rachel's look, or the laughter of strangers. Those things had no place in this office. We talked about documents, ownership, and the legal steps that needed to be taken. Leonard nodded more than he spoke. Occasionally, he asked for confirmation. "Are you sure?" Each time I answered with a slow nod. We signed the paperwork to sell the house. Not an immediate transfer, but enough to set the process in motion. I signed my name, familiar handwriting, steady, without hesitation. When the ink dried on the paper, I didn't feel like I had lost something. I felt like I had restored order to something that had been overturned for far too long. Leonard continued preparing other documents, revoking access, ending informal arrangements that no longer applied. I signed, reading every line, fully understanding every consequence. I wasn't doing this in anger. I was doing it with a clarity I had denied myself for many years. Leaving the law office, I didn't linger. I went straight to the bank. I had done business at this branch since I was young, back when Evan couldn't even read. The manager recognized me immediately and offered a polite smile, but when I stated my reason for coming, his expression grew serious. We went into a private room and closed the door. I presented the documents. No rambling, no emotion. I requested that the accounts Evan had access to be frozen. I asked that all funds belonging to my share be transferred to my personal account. The numbers appeared on the screen, clear and cold. The manager asked a few times, following procedure. I answered each question concisely. When the final steps were completed, I signed once more. Each signature felt like cutting another thread I had tied myself to over the years. There was no explosion, no dramatic scene, just a few clicks, a few confirmations, a few stamped pages. The law doesn't need emotion to function. It only needs clarity. I stepped out of the bank when the sun was already high. People moved busily along the street, unaware that in a small room behind them, an entire family order had just been dismantled. I stood on the steps for a moment, not to reconsider, but to feel the new sensation spreading through my chest. Relief. Not the relief of someone who has taken revenge, but the relief of someone who has finally set down a burden he carried for far too long. I felt no victory, no bitterness, just emptiness, and that emptiness didn't frighten me. On the way back, I didn't turn on the radio. I drove in silence, letting the steady hum of the engine fill the space. I thought of Evan, but not with anger. I thought of him as someone who had stepped outside the circle of protection I once built around him. What happened next was no longer something I needed to control. I returned home close to noon. Everything looked the same. The furniture was still there. The walls still stood. But I knew that from this moment on, the house no longer belonged to them in the way they believed. I went straight to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed. No one knew. Not yet. And that was what kept me calm. This was a war without gunfire. It didn't need declarations. It was already finished, quietly, in closed rooms, among people who understood the value of documents and signatures. I didn't need to prove I was right. I only needed to continue on my own path, lighter, straighter, and for the first time in many years, free. That morning came as ordinarily as any other. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, spilling onto the floor like it always did. There were no signs, no unusual sounds. I knew that, even though I was no longer in that house by then. I left before Evan woke up. Not in the middle of the night, not like someone running away, but at dawn, when the city was still half asleep. I carried a small bag, a few sets of clothes, essential documents, and the only thing that truly mattered to me at that moment: calm. I locked the door for the last time, placed the key in an envelope, and left it on the kitchen table, where I had stood silently hundreds of times without anyone noticing. No note, no signature, no explanation. I stepped outside while the sky was still a pale gray. The air was cool, clean, and so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps on the sidewalk. I didn't look back, not because I hated that place, but because I had finished everything that needed to be done. That house, for me, was closed. Meanwhile, elsewhere, Evan woke up with the familiar discomfort of a busy morning. He reached for his phone and checked his bank notifications out of habit. Then he froze, not because of a strange message, but because there was nothing at all. He opened the app and tried again. The screen loaded more slowly than usual. Then a notification appeared, short, cold, emotionless. The account was temporarily unavailable. Please contact your branch. Evan sat upright in bed. Sleep vanished instantly. He tried again, and again. The numbers didn't appear. The funds he had always taken for granted, used every day like air, suddenly vanished from his reach. He called the bank. His voice was urgent, unable to hide the panic. But on the other end, the response was steady, procedural, with no room for negotiation. Access had been revoked. The changes had been legally approved. Please contact the primary co-owner. Evan hung up, his heart pounding. He looked around the room as if the answer might be written on the ceiling. Then a name surfaced in his mind. Too late, but unavoidable. He rushed out of the room calling my name. No answer. The house was strangely silent. He ran to the kitchen and saw the envelope on the table. He tore it open and found only the key. Not a single line, not a single explanation. He tore through drawers, file cabinets, the study, places he had never paid attention to before. But the things he was looking for, documents, contracts, proof of ownership, weren't there. Or rather, they had never truly belonged to him. Rachel appeared in the doorway, her hair still messy, her voice irritated. "What's going on?" she asked. Evan didn't answer. He stood in the middle of the living room, breathing hard, like someone who had just had the ground pulled out from under his feet. He rushed outside, intending to go to work, to go straight to the bank. But when he put the key into the lock, he realized the next thing. The key no longer fit. The lock had been changed. He tried again, harder. Nothing. The door stayed shut. A cold sensation ran down his spine, deeper than any burst of anger. He stepped back and stared at the door as if it were something unfamiliar. The house he had once called his now rejected him, silent and final. And then, like the final cut, a moving truck appeared at the end of the street. 2 uniformed men stepped out holding paperwork. They spoke briefly, professionally. My name was on the contract. Ownership had been confirmed. They were there to carry out the transfer. Evan shouted. He said there had to be a mistake. He made calls everywhere, banks, lawyers, friends, but every call led him to the same answer in different forms. Everything had been completed. Legally. Irreversibly. Rachel stood frozen behind him, her expression changing. No laughter, no contempt, only confusion and a fear she had never tasted before. Evan collapsed onto the front steps. Everything fell apart, not with the noise he had imagined. There was no huge argument, no curses, just the disappearance of the things he had believed were foundations: money, a house, control. And I, at that moment, was sitting on another bus, somewhere else, holding a cup of cold coffee. I didn't look at my phone. I wasn't waiting for any calls. I knew they would come, and I also knew I wouldn't answer. Silence was the final answer I gave Evan, not because I wanted to punish him, but because every word at this point would be unnecessary. I had spoken enough over a lifetime, through money, through labor, through endurance. Now I chose to speak through absence. That morning, Evan lost everything he had taken for granted. And I, for the first time in many years, lost nothing more. I stayed in a small motel on the edge of the highway, the kind of place where people stop for one night and move on, where no one asks who you are, where you're from, or why you look like someone who has just closed an entire old life. The room wasn't large, just enough space for a single bed, a small wooden table, and a window facing the parking lot. But for me, it was enough. Quiet enough. Separate enough. Enough for me to breathe without having to explain myself to anyone. I set my bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the steady hum of the air conditioner. That sound carried no memories. It didn't remind me of family dinners, fake laughter, or familiar looks that had once made me question where I had gone wrong. It was just neutral noise, emotionless, and because of that, it was comforting. I took out my phone and looked at the screen for a moment. There were many missed calls. Evan's name appeared several times, followed by unfamiliar numbers. I didn't answer. I didn't read the messages. I turned the phone off, placed it in the nightstand drawer, and closed it. One simple motion, but it felt like cutting a cord that had wrapped tightly around me for years. No more contact. Not because I was afraid to face him, but because I had nothing left to say. Any explanation now would only serve someone else's need for relief, not mine. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to be selfish in a very quiet way. The days that followed passed slowly. I woke up early, made coffee with the small machine in the room, and watched the morning light gradually spill across the parking lot. Cars came and went. People came and went. No one noticed me, and I didn't notice them. I ate breakfast at roadside diners, where the servers called me "sir" in a neutral tone, without expectation or judgment. News about Evan reached me not through my phone, but through scattered bits of information life happened to bring my way. An old acquaintance I ran into at a cafe mentioned some commotion in my old neighborhood. Someone else spoke about Evan having financial trouble. I listened, nodded, and didn't ask more. Rumors traveled faster than the truth. People said Evan had lost the house. People said the accounts had been frozen. People said he had called everyone, from lawyers to friends, but no one could help. The stories were told with all kinds of tones, pity, curiosity, even satisfaction. I didn't take part in any of those emotions. Rachel left not long after. I heard that from someone who hadn't meant to tell me. She packed her things and left the city, leaving Evan with questions that this time no one would answer for him. The people who had once laughed around the dinner table, who had raised glasses in the house I paid for, began to avoid him. Evan's phone stopped ringing as often as it once had. Power, I realized, only exists as long as others believe in it. I didn't feel happy hearing any of this, but I didn't feel sad either. My emotions felt like a still lake after a storm. No waves, no ripples. Just a calm I hadn't been able to feel for a very long time. I didn't need to forgive to feel light. I didn't need to hate to feel right. I simply wasn't bound anymore. One afternoon, I drove away from the motel, heading farther south. There was no specific destination. I followed quieter roads where signs became fewer, where the landscape opened wider. I realized I had lived too long in cramped spaces, not because there wasn't room, but because there wasn't freedom. I decided to leave the city, not to run away, but to start again somewhere no one knew who I was except me. I sold the old truck and bought a simpler one. I rented a small room near the ocean, where mornings smelled of salt, and evenings carried only the distant sound of waves. No one asked what I used to do, who I had been, or how much money I once had. And I didn't tell them. For the first time in my life, I lived for myself. I walked every morning without carrying a phone. I read books, cooked for one, and sat for hours watching the horizon without thinking about pleasing anyone. Those small routines slowly filled the space I once believed only family could fill. Freedom doesn't arrive with cheering. It doesn't come with grand decisions or bold declarations. It arrives quietly, in choices that need no explanation, in waking up each day without fearing you'll disappoint someone. I disappeared from my son's map not as punishment, but as a natural consequence. Some relationships exist only as long as one side keeps enduring. When the endurance ends, so does the relationship. And in that disappearance, I didn't lose myself. I found myself again, a man who no longer needed to prove his worth through sacrifice, who no longer needed silence to be allowed to stay. I was there by the sea in a small room, with a simple and quiet life. No one called me father. No one called me a burden. No one spat in my face to prove power. There was only me and the peace I had traveled very far to find again. I left the town before the sky had time to change color. The streetlights were still on, casting a thin golden glow over the dew-damp road. I carried a small suitcase, not heavy, not much inside, just a few clothes, essential documents, and an old notebook that had been with me for years. I locked the door, placed the key in its familiar spot, and turned away. No letter, no message, no explanation, not because I was cruel, but because I understood that some relationships, once they have rotted at the root, cannot be saved by explanations. They only make the speaker hurt more, while the listener no longer has the capacity to hear. On the first bus out of the city, I took a seat by the window. The worn leather seat creaked softly as I leaned back. The engine started, and the bus rolled forward slowly. Through the fogged glass, familiar streets slid backward, like pages of a book read too many times. I watched them leave without crying. No tears fell. My throat didn't tighten. What I felt instead was a strange quiet. A quiet that wasn't painful or empty, but wide enough to set down all the burdens I had carried for years. I wasn't running away. I wasn't defeating anyone either. I was simply stopping the act of being hurt, stopping the effort to hold on to a place others had already decided to take away, stopping the belief that endurance was the only way to prove love. As the bus turned off the main road, I understood that I was doing something very simple, yet very difficult, choosing myself. The coastal town I arrived in wasn't special. A long stretch of sand, low houses, a few cafes open early, and waves moving steadily like breathing. I rented a small room with a window facing the sea. In the morning, salty air slipped through the cracks. At night, waves met the rocks with a sound like whispers that asked for nothing. No one there knew who I was, what I had lost, or how much I had given. And that eased me more than any words of comfort. I slowed down. I made coffee for one, watched sunlight move across the floor, read without hurrying to mark a page. I walked every morning, letting my feet choose the rhythm. I listened to myself, something that seemed obvious, but that I had neglected for far too long. In those moments, I realized that peace doesn't come from fixing everything, but from stopping the effort to fix what no longer belongs to you. Sometimes I still thought of Evan, not with anger, not with the sharp pain in the chest. I thought of my son with distance, a distance far enough that I didn't bleed, close enough that I could still see the lessons. I understood that fatherhood exists only where there is respect. When that dies, holding on isn't love, it's tearing yourself further. I didn't destroy my son's life. I simply stopped being the pillar that allowed him to keep standing the wrong way. Everyone has to learn to stand on their own legs. And sometimes, that lesson only comes when the familiar support is gone. One night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no waiting for the phone to vibrate, no worry about what I'd have to explain tomorrow. I woke up when the sun was already high, light filling the room, and for the first time in many years, I didn't have to ask myself what I needed to do to be allowed to stay. I had stayed with myself. This story, if you've listened this far, probably isn't meant to encourage a dramatic break or a harsh act. It's a reminder that dignity doesn't come from endless endurance. Kindness without boundaries becomes a ticket for others to walk over you. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's the only way to hear the truth. The story in this video is a work of fiction, inspired by real-life situations and human experiences, created to bring moral value, life lessons, and emotional resonance to viewers. It does not encourage imitating the actions in the video, does not incite harm, and does not target any individual or organization. I believe this story highlights a few important truths for all of us. Respect yourself before expecting respect from others. Set boundaries early, clearly, and consistently. Remember that love does not mean trading away your dignity. And if you are being taken advantage of, whether in family or any other relationship, learn your legal rights and seek support from a lawyer, from your community, or from people you trust. Don't carry alone what was never meant to be yours. Finally, if you've stayed with me until the end, thank you for listening. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about my decision. Leave a comment. Every story matters, and yours might help someone else who's lost find their way out. If this content resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, so stories like this can continue to be told gently and with care. Thank you for being here, for giving your time, and for choosing to listen. Sometimes that alone is an act of courage.